Hello and welcome to the final episode of the Mediate podcast. This is me, Harry, my final episode. Come to the end of a long journey, It's been an emotional ride. It's been about 6 years, maybe. But we finally made it. I have decided to abandon my previous picks to go to Mad Max Fury Road. I made the decision, I think, in the Apocalypse Now episode at the very end, getting annoyed at a comment someone made about Fury Road, to do Fury Road.
Yeah.
That someone is Ethan, by the way. So yeah, Mad Max Fury Road came out in 2015, directed and written by George Miller, who created the original Mad Max franchise in the late 70s, early 80s as kind of low-budget Australian films that had quite a lot of popularity in America. He's had a very strange career, ended up suing Warner Brothers over not really being paid enough for a film that he made, which eventually ended up with him obtaining the rights to Mad Max again and coming up with this kind of concept to do a modern Mad Max film, which entirely centered on a chase. And this film was in development hell. It's a very interesting story about how it got made. Essentially, kept like getting ready to go and then being delayed up to about 10-15 years of the film. Like, okay, we're ready to go. We've got all the sets ready. We've got, Mel Gibson's here. We're ready to go. To the point that Mel Gibson actually aged out of playing the character. It was delayed so long. But finally, they managed to get into the desert and shoot the film, which was an absolute nightmare. There are so many kind of behind-the-scenes stories of everyone hating each other, falling out. The production just being a mess with... It's essentially the Apocalypse Now story again, of behind the scenes. And at the very end of all of that process, they were just left with hundreds and hundreds of hours of footage that they kind of had to edit together. Everyone was unhappy with the project and was like, why do they do this shit? In these circumstances, you expect, okay, the film comes out, it's bad, it's a bomb, $150 million on a franchise that nothing's come out of for like 30 years. Director that's not made a film since Happy Feet 2. It's going to be a shit show. And it comes out and is a critical and commercial success. It's one of the rare modern films in which the audience and the critic consensus is pretty much universally acclaimed and kind of pretty much incredibly well aligned. It didn't make like an insane amount of money, but it was profitable. But yeah, it's one of those rare kind of movies where I think most people I've met like it, if not love it. And it's also very popular in like film circles, especially amongst filmmakers. I think Empire did a poll of filmmakers to find out their favourite films of the decade. And the list of directors who say Fury Road was the best of the decade is kind of astonishing. So there's something about this film that makes other people that make films envious, which I think is definitely interesting. So that's a little bit about the production. And I definitely will talk about why I like it and kind of delve into it, but I don't want to talk for like 15 minutes at the start. So I'm going to ask you guys, what do you think of Mad Max Fury Road and what's your experience with it?
Well, it's very well crafted, because I think the way I kind of came into it was first just hearing stuff and probably watching just kind of like analysis videos going, oh yeah, the editing is really great, the way they set up the way I forget what like the proper term for it would be, but the fact that your eyes are managing to make sense of all that's going on because of very clever editing tricks. So sort of before I ever got around to watching it, I just had this idea in my head of like, this is a very well crafted film. So that's kind of how I headed into it when I watched it for the first time. I think probably on like my brother's iPad screen, sitting down in the kitchen, on a dining room, and just really loving it from the first moment, really.
So when you say that about the editing, the film was edited by Margaret Sixel, who is the wife of George Miller, and actually did win an Oscar for the editing in this film.
Good.
So they were left with about 500 hours worth of footage.
God, that's almost as much as Retcon 2.
The film was storyboarded before the script was complete, so it was always the visuals and like the way the scenes were constructed were always intended to be shot in a certain way and put together in a certain way. They shot a lot of footage. I think they shot in sequence as well, which is crazy. So they shot the entire film chronologically, which is really rare. And then in terms of putting it all together, they made the point of focus in every single shot to be the center, which is kind of unique. And the way they do that is so they can cut quickly and slowly and jump around and have like 4 or 5 different things going on at once. But your point of focus is always central. So which makes a huge difference when you're watching the film, in terms of never kind of getting lost and always kind of being able to keep up with what's going on. And like I said, that was achieved by this technique, I guess, called centering, which sounds quite simple, but God, the amount of poorly kind of cut together action films that have been made, and even things like that are impressive. Like I know we've done Redline on this podcast, which I probably would like it more now if I rewatched it. But part of my issue with that film was that there was so much going on. I lost the ability to kind of keep up with it. And I think for me, Fury Road is a good level of just like craziness, and it's like there's so much going on because of the centering, and I think the editing decisions are really well made. I can always kind of tell what's going on, and it's like the perfect level of like anarchic chaos, but also really, really tightly controlled filmmaking. And I think the editing has a huge kind of impact on that.
Yeah, it's definitely very readable, and I think well crafted is a good way to put it. You know, there's always like a good setup, payoff sort of flow to things, whether it's in action scenes or even with like story or narrative elements. They always do a good job of like putting something in and then being like, oh hey, remember this thing? And then boom, that thing comes around and is important again later on. And wouldn't you know, that's how you make a film. Or so I'm told.
But I think that that centered technique that you're talking about works for me to a different level at different points in the film. So I think the scenes that Harry's talking about that are very chaotic and crazy, but still very tightly controlled, I do think are quite tightly controlled. But for example, that final sequence towards the end of the film where they're all trying to get back to well, I can't even remember what the area is called, but basically
the Citadel.
The Citadel, thank you. It's that last race back, because there's so many different moving parts, elements to it, so many different characters involved, and they're all small little microcosms of battles with different people on both sides. I struggled a little bit more to follow the geography of what was going on in that scene, who was engaged with who and stuff like that. But I think an example of where that works really, really well is in something that's a little bit simpler, which is that fight between Max and Furiosa.
Yeah. I was gonna
their
bring
kind
that
of
up.
first physical encounter, really, in the film. That's a really, really great sequence.
I don't know, working out how do you fight when you're chained to someone, there's also a car door there and someone's got a gun. And as well for the detail of sort of everybody getting involved as well. It's not one where you have your damsels in distress that just kind of lurk. Every character is involved and working in that fight.
Yeah, it's the way that the main focus of that fight is between two central people, but the way that it briefly incorporates elements of just other characters in the scene, occasionally getting involved somehow. So you've got Nicholas Hoult in one corner, you've got the group of women that Furiosa's trying to rescue as well, kind of getting involved here and there, and also never having that feeling of being overwhelmed, like you can't follow what's going on. That is when that technique is done really well, because there are quite a lot of cuts, even in a scene that's just not really vehicle-based combat, if that makes sense. It's just a physical confrontation between two people, and it works very, very effectively.
Yeah, I think that is one of my favourite sequences of the film. Largely benefited like by the editing and that centering technique, and also what you guys said about the character work. And I think the characters and the thing that Tony talked about, where almost everything has some setup and payoff, is what makes this film so satisfying to watch. The fact that this is an action film, yeah, and I'm sure we'll get into some of like the subtext or just text, because it's not very subtle, and like messaging of the film, but it's very satisfying filmmaking to see, and screenwriting as well, to see things set up and pay off. And the fact that this film was storyboarded before it was scripted, and shot in sequence means every kind of bullet that you see on screen is fired. Every character has some kind of resolution. Every like scene like that, it doesn't just forget someone exists. You can always see them in the background until they come into focus. And I think that kind of, I don't even know what to call it, but it's the type of filmmaking that uses every element to its disposal. And maybe there was a character that didn't do as much, and they probably got written out of the film.
Yeah, it's very efficient and I would say resourceful, much like you would have to be if you were a wasteland survivor. You know, it's a lot of like as you said, they cut out unnecessary things. They keep like a through line going of what you're meant to be paying attention to. There's little details with like practical effects of like if something gets destroyed in one scene, you pay attention to the next scene. Oh, hey, it's still gone, or they've replaced it off camera. That's neat.
I think one of my favourite moments in terms of that kind of consistency across the whole film is when they pile up all the guns they have into a bag, and then also make note, I think, in a later scene of just how much ammo they've got. It like you'll see all those guns used. The amount of ammo is important for coming scenes. It really helps make the world feel real, and then put you into the head of these characters where like bullets are as good as currency, guns are as an important tool as anything else. It's just
bullets have to be currency, otherwise there'd be no such thing as a bullet farm.
Yeah. It's actually like what is it fucking called? The Metro games, where your bullets are like the money. The bullets are their money. The bones are.
Okay.
Yeah, as Jono brought up with the world building, I want to point out that that's another very consistent element where a lot of like it's set in like a fantasy, not fantasy is the right word, but like, you know, like an alternate universe dystopian society.
I think that's just modern day Australia.
True. But yeah, it's set in this crazy world, but it does a good job of like naturally introducing you to elements of this story and not really forcing you to be like sit down and like fucking explain the rules of the world.
Yeah.
You know, it does like a seamless sort of introduction of elements of like these characters know what they're talking about. They wouldn't just sit around and be like, in this world, people fight using cars to survive in a water scarce environment. It just shows you that visually, which is probably one of the greatest strengths of this film, is its like visual conveyance of information.
I would agree with that, and I think especially when you're talking from I guess from an environmental and people point of view, where in a 2-hour film, primarily set in a desert, it manages to find different ways to make the environment and people that you come across quite versatile, and you meet different groups of characters who have different different motivations in the film. Yeah, most of them are probably just they come along to just get involved in the fucking carnage because they kind of enjoy that. But throughout the film, you have primarily desert. It's pretty much only ever desert. But then you'll be hit by a tornado at one part, and there'll be a canyon at one part with its own group of like bikers, and then you'll go into these this kind of swampy, sludgy area at nighttime, and all of a sudden, the kind of atmosphere feels like it totally changes for that sequence, and you see these shots of these like bird-like mutated creatures walking around on stilts or something, and it's just I find those scenes really, really fun and interesting to watch, and especially because, as Tony rightly pointed out, the film doesn't get bogged down in explaining every single detail of how it all comes to life. It just lets you watch visuals and piques your interest, and that's really good. That's a really, really strong part of the film for me.
Yeah, the concept of the kind of the tightness of the edit we were talking about, and also the way it kind of uses its visuals. I think what the film does really well, and a deliberate kind of thing that Miller tried to do was cut out as much dialogue as possible. So Max, who is the main character, although not really, I think he has about 50 lines in the entire film,
Wow.
which includes his monologue, which is the opening narration of the film. Basically, they try if there was something where if something could be shown rather than said, it was, and it is the ultimate example of show don't tell because of that. But also, it's not like a film. It's not like a silent film. There's so much dialogue that also doesn't need to be there. There's so much like I guess we call it flavor text and like item descriptions and world building, even though it's in a film of just people saying things that don't make sense. Because either they're funny, that they're like strange, or they kind of imply some like alternate history of the world. And that's one of my favorite things about this film. In the same way that this is a strange comparison, but in the same way I really love a film like Goodfellas or Uncut Gems, because the more you watch it, the more you just hear like the weird random things that people in the background like say as throwaway lines that are really entertaining. This film just has so many moments like that if you're not watching it with subtitles for like the second or third time, you just won't pick up on certain lines, and just in certain kind of funny bits, and then also certain implications about the world that come through the dialogue. And I really love the film's kind of use of language, and it's throwing away unnecessary exposition just to show you things, like just show that he's a universal donor on the back of his body. You don't need to tell them that. They can have McFeasting with the ancient ones.
Yeah, McFeasting was the one that I was thinking of, and I think that's like the world building is very interesting. How it has this like weird reverence for like the modern day, because presumably so much time has passed that like things have gained like this mythic quality. Like McDonald's is Valhalla, and the V8 engine is like a god of some kind. It's interesting. It's cool. It's neat.
I think that when you have a film that's so action packed and just based very much in I guess the motion of things coming together, I guess you don't really need that much dialogue. And when you look at someone like Max, I think he lets his movement talk for him rather than his words. Whenever you see him engaged in some kind of action-based exchange with another character, his instincts and reactions are so sharp. I think maybe my favourite example of this, even though it's such a small moment, is right at the end of the scene where he's fighting Furiosa, and he's got her pinned down, and he just fires these 6 bullets around her. It's just such a really cool small moment like that go to show just how much he has shaped his personality around the world that he's in, and that survival instinct that you just need to kick in, not wherever possible, but just always.
Yeah, that is a great moment as well. The sort of firing the warning shots around Furiosa, because it's like there's a great through line of like Nux rolling over and handing him the magazine or the clip or whatever.
The way they reload, I don't know why it's so satisfying, but it is as well. It's probably, if I'm gonna start waxing poetical badly, I guess it is kind of one of the themes of that whole group, where they are just kind of thrust together under terrible circumstances, but are working together because they have to, in that sort of moment of in that moment they are thrust together, they reload together, to then like, I don't know, move on, survive. I think one of my kind of favourite moments is of like just kind of silent communication is when or like mostly silent communication is when they're trying to snipe out the lights when they're stuck in the swamp, and Furiosa comes up to Max, who's got the sniper rifle, and says, "I'm the better shot." And I don't think Max says anything. He just looks at her for a bit and then just hands her the rifle, and then it is there as the rest, and just nothing needs to be said nothing more needs to be said at that moment. But it's just such a powerful moment of these characters working together and this sort of growing trust between them.
The best thing is I don't even think she says that. I think she just says how many bullets he has left. and it's his decision to give her
Yes.
to give her the rifle.
It's implied, I think. Yeah, so that's another good moment. I wanted to say that it's a point that I just came up with, was like with the way that this film is so like dialogue sparse and how it lets like the action do the talking, and it's very like clear, and also the world is like cohesive and makes sense. I realised this is the anti-Marvel movie, and that's why it's actually a good film. Even though I also will watch Marvel movies a lot, just because like the idea of like I realize now how like there's a distinct lack of like quips in any of these action scenes, and that makes them good. That makes them way better.
Come on. What if Max, before like hitting Furiosa with the door, just said, "Let me show you the door"? You know, that would be
Okay. Actually, that would also be good, because that would be funny. But
I'm glad I was able to come up with a quip off the top.
Yeah, that was quite impressive.
yeah, you've seen enough Marvel movies.
That just happened.
That's good.
There's definitely it stands out in modern filmmaking because of how tactile it is and how practical it is. I think something like 80% of all of the effects are practical effects, which is insane when you have this many cars in the desert smashing into each other.
To ensure the safety of everybody involved. I mean, it's got to be a very tight ship to make it all come together.
They just had to have people that have like steel for bones on set.
Yeah, because I think they avoided definitely any big injuries. Because the person who was the stunt director, I think, worked on one of the previous Mad Maxes, and he got, I think, pretty badly injured during one of those stunts.
Yeah.
So personally wanted to make sure nothing happened this time. I mean, obviously that would be your role anyway, as in charge of stunts. But
but this time it's personal.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. But like you see some of the stuff that they were doing, like the pogoing stuff.
It's so good.
Just like how.
Yeah, and also the fact that you're making this film, you're like, right, we want to keep everyone safe, but we're also going to have a guy on like a bungee cord playing a flaming electric guitar on this moving vehicle. It does not need to be there. Is very, very goofy, but also makes me laugh every time. And I think is really fun. And it's this like unnecessary excess of like, do you really need random shots of this film just to play at different frame rates for no reason? Do you need like the saturation of images just to like wildly vary? Like they kind of just it's a very extra film, which I like. George Miller just kind of goes all out and does very strange things he doesn't need to do, and it's those small details that really make the film for me. And I'd just like to kind of go back to what Ethan was saying when he was talking about Tom Hardy, because even though he doesn't have much dialogue, it is, in my opinion, a phenomenal performance. Just like Ethan was talking about his physicality, and like when he does have dialogue, like the weird like grumbly way he like delivers his lines, and what they're kind of trying to convey with this character, of course, is his arc of someone who, because of trauma in his past, which you can assume is a truncated version of the previous Mad Max films, so that doesn't really matter. Has resigned himself to living as an animal, and cutting himself off from humanity. Shrouding his face in like this like raggedy hair and beard, and just kind of like living in the desert. Like the first shot of him, which is an incredible shot, and then he kind of eats that lizard like hunched over and like stares dead into the eyes of the audience. And very slowly, as the film goes on, finds that humanity, and his body language changes, the way he delivers his lines changes, his appearance changes, and I think it's the way that theme of kind of redemption through Max's character is conveyed by Hardy, who has very little dialogue, I think is really phenomenal. And sometimes like the physical aspects of acting aren't appreciated enough, that someone who doesn't deliver much dialogue but has a lot of not just kind of complicated kind of like choreography and action stuff to do, but just to deliver so much with like looks and body language. I think it's a film. It's a performance that could make or break the film, and I don't think Mel Gibson's version of this version of Max, if that had existed, I don't think this would be half the film that it is.
That's a really good point, Harry. But this probably brings us on quite nicely to maybe the next thing that we could talk about, which is, even though Tom Hardy's performance could make or break the film, I think Furiosa's is equally as vital in that way. In the sense that I think I mean, you haven't jokingly said this. You've said she is the protagonist, and I think I probably jokingly disagreed with you at the time, but I do agree. I think Tom Hardy, even though he kicks off the film, he has a bit more of a side character quality to him, because it feels like from the beginning the character that has the real motivation, the real quest to fulfill, from start to end. Even though Hardy's got his own things that he needs to deal with along that journey, are Furiosas. And I think that Charlize Theron is maybe not as, from the way you've described it, you kind of sold me that yeah, he might even give a better performance. But the thing about Charlize Theron is she has to play such a hardened character, like a hardened warrior, and at the same time in certain scenes, in certain parts of the film, really break down and show just how much things can get to her at certain points, and to see her pain come through, I think it's a really, really good contrast that she gets absolutely right. And it's a difficult thing to balance, being very I guess closed off and someone who you shouldn't really mess with, because they don't say much, they don't talk much, they just be, and then at the same time have those scenes where she can afford to really show off, well, Charlize Theron, an actress. So yeah, she's really good in the film.
Yeah, they did a great job of making her a character where she does have this like incredibly badass side to her. You know, she takes no shit, takes charge of a lot of situations, you know, engages with violence in a way that you very rarely see like female leads or actors do, at least in, you know, like the other films I see, Marvel movies. But at the same time, they also have her come across in this cool way without making her like a girl boss, you know. Instead, she's a much more like human character who you can appreciate, has this depth, you know, this ability to be both very empathetic, because, you know, she's putting her life on the line to save the Morton Joe's wives, and also is like doing it out of like this sense of like guilt of who she is, of like, oh man, I've been complicit in the crimes of the state by being a Furiosa for so long. And also she's a badass. Also she shoots people in the head and it's cool.
I think Ethan said human, and I think that's the word that really strikes when I think about Fury Road. Like, when I'm watching it, I am constantly going like, oh, this is so cool, and like laughing at like all the other goofy bits, and, you know, like physically reacting and quite viscerally reacting. But I'm also, I feel this film very deeply, and I think it is a very deeply humanist film. Not just because it kind of has the same politics that I do, but because it kind of, I think it's a film that genuinely kind of cares about people and its characters, and there are a lot of moments that I would describe as kind of beautiful. And the way it kind of lets all of its characters be very human and be fully fleshed out. Apart from maybe its villains, which we can talk about later.
Yeah.
I think that
I think that's a conscious choice on its part, though. I think it definitely wanted its villains to be like almost like cartoonishly evil.
Yeah.
As like a backdrop for like the more humanized good guys.
I'm just imagining a future in which we get Immortan Joe, but like Maleficent style film.
No.
I mean, they're making a Furiosa prequel, so who knows what the fuck that's gonna be.
Yeah.
He's just misunderstood.
No, don't do it. Have him just be evil, because then it's cool when his face gets ripped off. If he was a human character, it wouldn't be as good. It would feel a bit more conflicted about like, oh, is it all right to, you know, use violence to overthrow the state? This film doesn't want you to have that concern. This film is like, yeah, it's fun and good when you do that, which is correct.
I think it doesn't just show you Joe and not really delve into him, though. I think there are moments which like the first shot of Joe like as this kind of like body that's being sprayed with some kind of powder, and then like you see him putting the armor on before presenting himself to people. I think that
There's fake muscles.
yeah, you kind of see his fake muscles. You see his ideology, I guess, which is more what he is, like what he represents politically, and how the kind of the first 15 minutes, which actually I say the film was shot chronologically, they shot the entire film but didn't have the first 15 minutes to kind of say to Warner Brothers, give us more time and money, please. And it's almost like a prelude to the film, which sets up all the key conflicts and all the things you have to remember for the end and the ideologies and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it does a good job of showing you what Joe's all about, and what kind of needs to be defeated by defeating him as a character. So I think he does. There's more nuance to him in the way he works, but I also agree that yeah, they have to set up a guy who you're happy to see his face get ripped off.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do not, my friends, become addicted to water.
Exactly.
Although I do think who does have a very good like bad guy redemption story is the lowly mook Nux, who takes like the sort of the political viewpoint of Immortan Joe. You know, he is one of his followers, but then his journey is about sort of realizing the error of that, and eventually like his repeated story is like he wants to sacrifice himself in the name of McDonald's, in the name of Shell, of various oil companies.
Fukushima Kama Crazy War Boys.
Yeah, he wants to go out with a bang in some form of like violent display, but for like perpetuating this like weird religious cult that is the War Boys following Immortan Joe, and eventually that is subsumed where instead he goes out with like an act of sacrifice for one of the people he was initially tasked to hunt down, which is nice. You know, that's like a good redemption story, and he is much more sympathetic and likable.
Yeah, I mean, just imagine if, like, you as part of your kind of weird belief system, basically your leader was almost this godlike figure you had to impress, and then you like tripped up in front of him and he laughed at you. Like, that's got to feel pretty bad.
Yeah, they definitely do a good job showing kind of de-radicalization through Knox's character. And it also is a good insight to kind of how the War Boys work and what their ideology is.
Yeah.
That they're kind of in this post-apocalyptic world where a lot of them, I think all of them actually have some form of kind of radiation poisoning and very short lives, and because of that they kind of dedicate their lives and, like you say, going out in an act of sacrifice to the promise of a kind of better place and a better world. But really all they do is kind of perpetuate the hierarchical system, which is very subtly shown by Joe lording over everyone and you know, slowly like piddling out his infinite resources or near infinite resources to the masses, and telling them not to want too much, you know.
I mean, another of those visual things where you've got Joe atop his, I mean, it's not a castle, but may as well be a castle, and then you've got the convoy on the road and it's all flat.
So Nicholas Holt's character, I can't remember what his name is, he's probably one of the characters that I'm a little bit less keen on, actually, and his arc. Not that I think the arc is necessarily bad, and the thing that I think one of his redeeming qualities is what he represents. You're right, there's that cultist aspect of what he's a part of and his motivations and what he drives towards and what he sees as good and sees as bad is stuff that I find interesting. It's just that there are a couple of things that make me less keen on him. So first of all, I'm actually not too keen on him as an actor. That's part of it, and I'm not too sure why. I don't really connect with his performances. Secondly, I find that his transition is just not entirely believable for me. When I think about how someone could be de-radicalized, I see it as a very, I guess turbulent is probably an understatement, but as a very, very difficult, long-winded process. I realise that in the constraints of a 2-hour film, it's hard to show that. But because of that, what you end up with is a character who's so different to how he was at the start of the film. and I don't find that process of I think the characters that he meets that influence him don't influence him to me in a way that's convincing enough for me to see the character that he is at the end. Now, when I look at the kind of person that Max is and how his personality changes, how he learns to believe in something other than just pure survival and just trying to stay alive. I find that part a lot more believable, and I'm not entirely sure why. I just think it's because maybe, I don't know.
It is a very sharp turn. It's a complete U-turn, to use a car metaphor.
Yeah, and I don't mind. Like I said, I don't mind U-turns. I just think it comes a bit too quickly, and as a result, when his sacrifice actually does come around, a moment that's probably supposed to be quite poignant for most people, I think if I remember correctly, I can't quite remember how it comes together in my head. I remember finding a bit goofy actually, and not thinking. Tonally, it's not quite as sad as I wanted it to be or thought it would be. And I think part of that is just because it is such an incredibly radical change to someone who seems like he's devoted his entire life, his entire ideology to one person in particular and the religion that kind of surrounds him, that the War Boys are a part of, and then changing so much to overthrow it. I'm sure there's more to it than that, but it can't just be because Immortan Joe laughed at him because he tripped on a vehicle.
I think it is more to do with the fact that, like, I forgot their name, but it's is it Capable, or one of the Immortan Joe's wives does take like a good, sees the good in him, and I think their relationship is like the turning foundation. And it's like the classic example of like, I can fix him, you know. In real life,
you're
don't
right.
Do that.
You're right. That is the turning point, Tony. But you can't. She turns him around in 10 minutes flat. 15 minutes, he falls off the thing.
That's just the power of the eager GF. That's what they can do. He is literally he's a Gamergate on the alt-right pipeline guy, but then he watches a ContraPoints video. He's like, I've been saved. That's what happened in real life. It's what happened in this film.
Well, I'm going to be honest. I think ContraPoints it would do a much better job than what that woman does in the film to completely turn his nature around like that.
The ContraPoints video on the fucking why Immortan Joe should be cancelled. There's a good moment where Mad Max, there's another tight storytelling through line that comes by the exchange of shoes. First, I believe it's Nux steals his shoe. You know, there's the moment where he's like, I got a shoe, pick me, coach, to go on the football team, and then he steals it back, and then Mad Max steals it back. But then there's a bit where he's like, he's earned the trust. Mad Max steals a shoe from someone else, gifts it to Nux. That's a wordless exchange of going from like, oh, these two hate each other, to being like, actually no, you're cool now, here's a shoe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in comparison with like the closest figure Nux has to a friend back at the Immortan Joe side of things, like it's the guy that he kind of fights over being able to drive the vehicle for. Like, you can see there's nothing really there between those two beyond just almost like we are colleagues.
At the same time, you imagine that he's had a life before this film, a life of being conditioned constantly to being part of a singular entity, regardless of what partners you have, friends you have, people who are supportive of you. I still think running into this group of people, for me, it just doesn't quite do it for me. That's all.
I want to bring something up. I know we moved past it from earlier, that a lot of the film is shot practically, and on one hand, I appreciate that that's a very like impressive feat to do technically, but on the other hand, I also feel that, like, again, this is coming in with another big point that I also want to talk about, is like the color grading choices they made with this film. Like it looks good. Like, I'm not going to say it looks bad, but they've chosen to grade the film in a way that makes it look very stylized, and like it's cool and impactful, but it's also a bit cartoony. It's a bit otherworldly, you know. It's a bit like, not fake, but you know, you kind of like get a sense of like it not being as real. It's like
There's like a hyper reality to it, isn't there?
Yeah, like a hyper reality. That's a good way of putting it. But on the other hand, it's like if you're going to make it look like that, if you're going to choose to have this very stylized take on reality, you probably could have gotten away with not using as much practical effects because they don't look as real as they would do if they were just color graded to just look like real life, you know? Like I feel like a lot of the explosion effects, if I saw them from like a dash cam, I'd be like, oh my god, I'm gonna die in real life from having seen it, because they'd be so terrifying if you saw them from like a more grainy, a more grey, you know, the way the real world is, you know, horrible and miserable. Whereas this is like it's like bright yellow, you know, it's so like luminous. And although that does look cool, like don't get me wrong, it looks cool, but the only point with it is like it doesn't feel like I'm not being hit with like the reality, like oh god, as much as I probably could have been.
Yeah, I think that stems slightly just because I'm just thinking now how just like it is kind of true watching little clips of how they did some of the practical effects. You're like more on the edge of your seat, but I think it's because it's much more. You're like, well, that's a real human that could get injured and died.
Yeah, that's what I want in a film. I want death. You should eat the guy, crash the car.
Yeah, with Mad Max, it's still like, well, you know, even if Mad Max dies, like that's a fictional character.
Yeah, true.
So I guess some of that is just the kind of difficulty of you are sitting in a cinema, or you know, watching it on a screen in a way that is detached from that. I think the stylizing sort of works, but it does kind of stem from, I think, like the initial Mad Max stuff, because George Miller, is that his name, used to be like a first responder, and in Australia they had a massive problem with just like illegal streetcar races.
Yeah.
Resulting in a lot of crashes and injuries. So like it was seeing these crashes and these injuries that it gave George Miller the idea for Mad Max. So like at a certain point, these films are kind of based on the real don't be safe when you drive, kids.
It's interesting with you saying about the color grade as well, Tony, because there is a black and white version of this film as well.
Yeah, I was interested in watching that because I was like, maybe that would like trick my brain into being more like this is real life, even though it's black and white. And if things stopped being in black and white one day when they invented color TV and cameras.
I don't think you ever would think this is real life though, because of, like we said, the hyper reality and like the fact that there's weird frame rate changes, and the film always wants you to like, it never wants you to like buy in as like this is like real life. I think it always wants to create that separation of this is fake, this is a film, and I think it does that deliberately. A, so it can be enjoyed as like an action film, but then B, when it like breaks down those barriers and has like very kind of human moments, I think they hit even harder. That being said, the color of that sequence, like I do want to watch the black and white version. But there's that one scene where they go into the storm and the film becomes like red with like these like lightning strikes that turn the film black and white. And it's such a stunning like visual like sequence, and it looks so like incredible, and it always takes my breath away. And the fact you get it so early on as well, which is great. I always think like if I'm watching the black and white version, I'm just not having as good a time in this scene. And that always stops me from making my next viewing the one where I watch it in the black and white version. But I'm definitely going to check it out.
I always wonder why they choose to create black and white versions of films in colour that seem so well suited to being in colour. Yeah, when Parasite came out and then it had that black and white re-release, I was thinking, but this film looks so good in colour and it uses colour really, really well. A black and white version of this film would feel like it detracts from the experience. And one of the great uses of colour, I think, in this film, I talked earlier about how significant but still desert-like environmental changes are really interesting. I think one of the greatest uses of colour is towards the start of the film when they're at the Citadel and you just see this kind of rusted, yellowy orange wasteland spread as far as the eye can see. But then at the top of these cliffs and these kind of towers of rock, you just see green.
Yeah.
and you
the
see
green place.
exactly, and it really pops out to me, and it just stands out so much because your eyes are naturally drawn to something that isn't, well, just yellow and orange like so much of the film is, and it's why that nighttime sequence appeals to me so much, because it's got this cool natural transition where it stops being a film that's just blue sky and orange desert to something that's got a bit more of a unique texture, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
But
it breaks the film up, doesn't it?
it does. It does.
Yeah.
Now, going back a second ago to what we were talking about, which was the I guess the hyper realism. So I don't know if this is right, but it seemed like there were two kind of frame things that they were doing, where there were parts where there were missing frames, and there were parts where they'd sped up the frame rate. And the sped up frame rate, I think, is what heightens that sense of hyper realism. And I don't think I minded that as much, but if it's not already obvious, I'm probably the person who likes this film the least, but still does like this film. I think the thing that I dislike the most about this film are those missing frame rates, because the action scenes themselves are so, like, I don't want to use the word bombastic, because that's just a dumb,
You've used it
archaic
now.
word, but okay, well, I've used it now, so I've got to commit to it. But they're so larger than life and epic, and just have a real scale to them, that I want to enjoy them. But for a film that's 2 hours and is just action, yeah, I know there are scenes where they bring the pace down a little bit, but for me they're so short lived that so much of the film is just action sequence after action sequence after action sequence, and you're met with that frame rate kind of technique very, very early on. But it gets to the point where 5 minutes in, I've already got a bit of a headache from watching this film, because it's just not something that I'm used to watching, and I understand the merits of using the technique. I think it's a really, really good idea. It probably works for a lot of people, but for me, I don't know, my eyes struggle to follow and like comprehend what I'm looking at, and it's just so, it's like the pace of what I'm watching is too much for my brain to handle, that it just hurts my head. And it happens 5 minutes in. As soon as Max is captured and he escapes, you're already met with that, and it kind of sets the film off on a kind of a sort of a bitter taste for me early on, which isn't good, not for me.
Yeah, it's unfortunate.
Yeah, I didn't even realize there was like frame rate changes.
Yeah, I have the eyes of a gamer. I only see things at 20 FPS, so I didn't notice.
Yeah, the final chase scene's really ruined by the frame rate. The Immortan Joe
lags.
boss fight.
Thank God they patched it.
If you watch the film on a better console, it's a lot smoother.
They're gonna port the film.
Yeah, the hitboxes as well for some of Morton Joe's attacks, just they don't match up with the visuals. It's honestly a travesty.
Thankfully, the only thing that has ever given me that sort of visceral pain sensation from the way like a film is constructed is
listening to Bjork.
is I was gonna say is the red filter from the flame in There Will Be Blood.
Come off it, Tony.
Because it looks like I'm taking damage, and so my brain is like, you should be in pain, and I'm like, okay. But yeah, I understand those like complaints about like the pacing thing. I think it's ultimately is very intentional though, from the films at least, and it's like a desired effect, even if it doesn't personally work for you. Is like it is working towards the goal of being like unique and very like tightly interwoven into a cool action film.
I like the idea that it was just an accident. It's like, oh fuck, we're missing half the frames.
We didn't render it properly. We got to run it through Premiere Pro again.
Shit.
I just want to
glad.
make it known really quickly
Yeah,
that I wasn't in visceral pain watching this film, right? It's nothing like Tony's experience with the red filter from There Will Be Blood. The way I describe it is that like someone put a bolt in my brain and just let it kind of roll around in there, where it was like it wasn't causing me to suffer, but it was enough of an inconvenience that it was starting to hurt a little bit, and more so as the film gets on, because this kind of movie, yeah, like I said before, there are moments where it calms down a little bit and you get some good character growth, some good character development, dialogue exchanges, things like that. But for me, this film kind of starts off loud, and it doesn't have quiet. It just has more loud, and then more loud, and then more loud after that. And so that sensation I get in my head just becomes more and more pronounced as the film goes on.
Mad Max Fury Road is a very good film, I think. But what makes it even better is the fact that it's PC gone mad, you know. It's woke propaganda. I know. It's amazingly popular for a film with like the message that it has. Like I don't know how if people just are able to watch it on like such a level that they don't engage with like the politics of it.
Yeah, especially since they're so obvious. They're not.
It came out in
it's not,
2015 and like the height of like hating on feminism being like super popular, and like SJW owned was like just coming into like the culture and stuff. But like it's a film about a guy who like overthrows a patriarchal system that like like oppresses women, and he does that through like solidarity and love and like intersectional like feminism, and it kind of trying to bring back like a lost world in the midst of like climate collapse, you know, where you've got this kind of like fascist kind of capitalist oppressive patriarchy represented by Joe and his kind of like cult of like young angry men that are subjugating and controlling women who have no bodily autonomy, and it's kind of regaining that, and in the end is kind of fighting back against it, not just running away. And I think it's humanist elements and its politics kind of fused together with like the awesome action and the fantastic filmmaking into just being this like really like prescient and powerful like piece of like modern art. Where it kind of like it's timeless in the sense that you could watch it this week and be like, God, this film is like, it has so much to say about what's currently happening in the world, and as like things keep getting worse and the climate crisis keeps getting worse and women's rights, you know, like keep getting taken away, it's just going to feel more and more prescient and powerful and human.
It's going to keep getting more relevant until it becomes true.
Pretty much.
Yeah, well said.
I think it might just be a case of people are very bad at understanding metaphors.
Yeah,
like
Tony's
the general
absolutely
public.
right.
They're so
on the nose, but because they don't literally use the word like capitalism, because it's not literally like, you are the president, I'm gonna kill you, or something like that. It's like, oh no, this is a fantasy world. Yeah, this is like made up. Like, it's not political. It's not real. That's what people think. That's how people think.
Tony, I don't think that people watch this film and like didn't realise the subtext or as we like jokingly said, the text, because it's so on the nose. I think the reason this film is probably so popular is because people like to go and watch a film and have a good time and appreciate, you know, good stunt work, good action set pieces, probably who they think of as a male protagonist played by a really popular actor with other popular actors in the film as well. So I maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think politics probably factors as much for it being incredibly popular. But it's not the first time that a film's been incredibly popular and people have just completely overlooked what the director was trying to say. I mean, Fight Club's like a great example of this, where it's a film that is really left leaning, but it's incredibly popular, and people either misread the film completely or just see the surface level and don't bother looking any deeper, which is a shame.
One of the things that's making me think of at the moment is Star Wars, and just some of the weird takes on Twitter at the moment with that world. There's just this wonderful exchange where I think it's someone saying, "Oh, Star Wars has got political now," and then someone saying, "Well, like the original trilogy was like about Vietnam," and so the response being like, "That can't be true. If that was the case, then America would be the empire." And it's just like, dude.
That's impossible.
You've said it. You found it. You've just not read it. You know. Ugh.
I think it does help that this is like a film by like an Australian. Like you have that outsider perspective. Johnny mentioned George Miller's background coming from being a first responder in car culture in the original Mad Max, it's a very strange trilogy of films because the first is very good for a low budget film, but it doesn't really hold up, and the third is just too out there and too strange. But the second is this like beautiful kind of like synthesis of an American / Australian version of The Man with No Name, I guess, because I guess they're Italian American, those films, of this mythic kind of road warrior figure in this post apocalyptic scenario, coming to like it's the same story basically, like coming to help people, and that is my favorite version of Mad Max. Like the other films all have a different Max, and this has the same as the Road Warrior Max. It's kind of the same type of story, and I think is what they should just make hundreds of. They should make hundreds of just this figure coming into different like scenarios and circumstances that are kind of thinly veiled metaphors for like real world issues, and dealing with them, and then moving on. I think it's a cool vehicle, pun intended, like mechanism for storytelling.
Yeah.
And I like the way that this is like a modern recreation where they keep the car culture stuff, but it's less about the cars and it's more about the engines and the oil, especially in this kind of like I say, this is like a climate crisis fueled world that we're living in, where through the kind of opening narration, it basically shows you what causes the apocalypse. You've got the who killed the world line, and I guess you can kind of extrapolate from that what's happened to everything, to water, to food, to women, how it's all become commodified, but also how much that's just a representation of like the current state of things. So yeah, I like the way this film takes the best interpretation of Max and does what I think Mad Max 2 does, but it just goes further with it, where it extrapolates it into like a specific kind of political context, and also just a very interesting narrative proposal, which is the whole film, which is like, what if we made a chase for 2 hours, and does that work for you? And I think for most people it does. Some people it doesn't, and actually no, for everyone it doesn't, because the interesting thing is, of course, you reach almost the end, and there isn't anywhere to run to. Like a fabled better place doesn't exist, and the characters have to turn around and do what they should have done from the start, and fight to make the system a better place.
We have to go back and speak about the structure of this film. Yeah, I understand the argument. The turnaround hating faction.
The meme, the whole reason we're doing this podcast.
I understand. Basically, the premise is that it's like they turn around, and they go back, and they have to the film plays in like a kind of reverse order, like it recontextualizes the scenes, the settings, like the locations, and also some of the events that have previously happened, by like having you revisit them, see them in a new light, which on one hand is cool. On the other hand, is it anticlimactic? Who knows? Jono, famously, you're a turnaround faction enjoyer. What do you think of the turnaround gate?
I just don't see how you could really frame this film in any other way. Like it just works. It wouldn't be a complete film without. Well, we've got to go back. It's like you set up this horrible place basically in the opening, and like that's one of the big things. This kind of water monopoly that's going on there. Like this system that needs to be changed, and like that has to kind of be the resolution of it. Otherwise, it's just if people run into the desert and then are now in the desert. Like I don't know, you need that to then make it a full plot.
Interesting.
Like the things that come to mind is like some of the films that are closest to just like a prolonged getaway scene, not scene but like
Ambulance.
Yeah. Oh, I've not seen that, so I'm not going to bring that up, but you've got, I think, Empire Strikes Back and then like The Last Jedi, and like the big moments in those are when like when characters kind of turn around and go, well, we can't just run. We've got to go and like save our friends. Is basically, I guess, in both those films the kind of big moment, and like that's what then leads it to a conclusion, is turning back and doing something in some way. I don't know. That's my rough ramblings on it. I don't see that there's an argument here because I don't see what the alternative is.
Yeah, that's definitely one way of putting it. That's one side of the debate. However, in the name of a balanced argument, in the name of the free marketplace of ideas,
A plane needs both wings, Tony.
you know what, we're like the political forward car that Andrew Yang is driving. You know, it's not left or right. It's onwards and then turning around, maybe, but not left or right. And also the car has like a spike on it because it's Mad Max themed now. Yeah. Ethan, what are your thoughts on Turnaround Gate?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask me, Tony. I had this argument already in person with you and Harry briefly. I think the original thing that I said was that as a writer, you're only limited by your own imagination, and that when you reach that point and the green place doesn't exist, to me it's not just you have two choices. You can go out into the desert and there's nothing there, which is obviously not what you should do. I never thought that was a good idea to have the film be them just going to the desert further on. But then the other choice is you go back to where you started and try and change things there. But to me, it's not just those two different choices you have. As a screenwriter, you have an infinite amount of things that you can do with your story. Now, I realised that with the confines that George Miller had made, there really was only two options. But that's only because there were two options with the story that had been presented, and that was the point I was trying to make. That for me, there is a little bit of an anticlimax there. Maybe not an anticlimax as such, just a feeling like, well, hang on, we were already here. We spent an hour and 30, 40 minutes going to this place, and now we've gone from A to B, we're back to A. And yeah, I realised that but when you're writing a character, you're writing a story, that there's a difference between what you want and what you actually need. Now I get that, and they're rarely the same, you know. And that's part of having an arc, that's part of changing, that's part of growing as a character. But for some reason, every time I've watched this film, for some reason, them going back to the start and having that end where everything seems better, Morton Joe is dead. I don't know why, but there's just something about it that feels... And this is the thing, I can't think of the right adjective that I want here, because it's not really anticlimactic at all, because you get a fantastic sequence out of it. You get an amazing action set piece with the chase back to the Citadel and who can reach it first. But no, I don't know if I really agree with that anymore. I think I probably lean more to what Jonathan thinks now.
The
and I
pro
think what you two
turnaround
think.
Faction, I see.
Yeah, I've been de-radicalised. What can I say?
No, I do understand like your argument. I think there are two arguments. There's the like it doesn't suit my like preferences that they turn around, and like I wish that the film had kind of come up with a conclusion that I didn't see coming and kind of did something different. Which like yeah, I mean that's fair enough. That's also the kind of I think why I kind of get like have been annoyed with you like both on and off the podcast is because there's like another argument of being like oh it's lazy screenwriting, it's you know the cinema sins, like oh you know you didn't need a film, they could have just stayed at the Citadel, that kind of like very like reductive argument as well, which I think is just kind of bad criticism of like, because like obviously the characters are literally going in one direction, figuring themselves out, and then once they've reached the end of their journey and they've reached the end of their arc, they turn around. You know, it's the film's not subtle.
Yeah, and I see that now. I think when I was first 15 or 16, and I was at the time disappointed by what had been a very hyped up film at that point, I think maybe I was looking for a scapegoat and I wanted just one thing that I could blame it on. And in reality, over time, I've realised on my third viewing now, my opinion of this film is that there is a lot to be liked and enjoyed, and a lot that is very, very good about it. But the ending is probably not what it once was. I think it, for me, and I'll recap this a little bit more when we're giving scores. I think it really is just it's the experience of watching something that to me knows only one volume and just kind of goes up from there, and doesn't to me know really how to balance. It doesn't know how to balance different volumes. And when you're making a film that is so action packed, an hour and a half is one thing, but 2 hours is something different, and you start to feel that a little bit. Because I mean, I'm sure all of you have watched films in the past where there is so much going on that you think, how can I be bored? It's just 2 hours of just shit going down. But it can get quite stale quite quickly. Not to say that this film necessarily gets stale, just that I feel like once I've experienced half an hour of this film, I've just experienced the next hour and a half, except only slightly louder than what I just experienced, if that makes sense.
I think that me and Ethan have come to some sort of redemption. You know, we do that handshake and that nod
Exchange
in the
shoes.
desert, and then we turn around and we do another hour and a half, and it's amazing. I get exactly everything that you say about the film, Ethan, and I'm glad that your kind of like feelings on the ending are more like, are less like cinema sinsy, like oh, it's lazy writing, and more like, oh, like, you know, just it doesn't gel for you, which is fair enough. And same with like pretty much every element of the film. Like, I understand what you mean about it being like one level of volume for you and how things don't click. And I think that's why I find it a bit frustrating you don't like it, which is like fair. You don't have to like it, and like there are obviously things like I like that you're not gonna like. But I think because our tastes align so much, when there is like a small thing like this where you intellectually understand everything we're saying, but you just don't feel it, that kind of frustrates me. And it's like, I'm not saying it's like your fault. I'm just like, God, I wish you could like be me and watch this film and like get the things that I get out of it, like in terms of just being like really engaged and just clicking with like the level of volume it's at. Yeah, that I guess that's where the frustration comes from. That it's just like I know that you understand everything I say, and you might even agree with some of it on paper, but like when it comes down to watching it, this film makes you feel like you have something rattling inside your head. Whereas for me, this film makes me feel like I can like fly. Like it's just like a completely the opposite reaction to it. And yeah, and also I think some of that as well that we haven't really mentioned might be to do with the music, and the Junkie XL score, which kind of underpins the whole film and sums it all up too. It is completely like it's loud, it's bombastic, it's heavy metal, it's, you know, it's like it's AC/DC, it's kind of doom, and it the fact that when the kind of war party are driving along and this music's playing, like, is it diegetic, is it non-diegetic? You've got like the guitar player coming in, the engines, you know, they sound like the drum, you know, you've got drums, but like the engines sound like the kind of roaring of the electric guitar. All of that kind of like loudness, for me, it just like I start like rocking along to it, you know, I'm like doing the drums in the air, being like, oh, this is sick. Whereas I think for you that annoys you, or like it gives you a headache. And I think that might be like the metaphor that like sums up our reactions to the film.
Yeah, I agree with everything you've just said. I think ultimately what it comes down to is just preference. Like, I don't think it's a badly made film. I don't think the politics are bad. I think the politics, as you summarised yourself, Harry, are really, really good. It is just, how do you interact with a film, and what kind of techniques and styles work for you and what ones don't. And I think for me, I see objectively all of the really good qualities this film has, but as I experience them, they don't quite hit in the same way that they do with you or Jonathan or even Tony.
Yeah. Although I'm doing my own film review turnaround. I'm saying this film is actually not good. No, I'm kidding. It's good. But speaking of turnaround gate, like, I want to say that as much as this film does have a lot of very bombastic elements, and I am going to use that word shamelessly, these hyped up like elements to it, like it's got a great energetic score, a lot of the action scenes are like these tightly controlled, interwoven, like followable and understandable, but at the same time intense and hectic. It's got these great high energy moments, but at the same time, like the story as it flows, you know, it is very simple. It is just a simple case of like, well, we have to run away from these people because we don't want to be there anymore, to changing their mind to be like, actually, let's run back to fight them instead by beating them there. And on one hand, I understand why that you would do that, because that's a good way to like ground all of these disparate, very intense elements in a film, is to have them be bolted onto the central element, which is this car chase. You know, it helps keep things like laser focused, and it despite its length, it does feel like a very like well paced film. But at the same time, like I'm the kind of person that is like, when funky boys show up 40 minutes into a film, where it's like, hey, this film now is about aliens that are nuclear bombs. I'm like, yes, that's what I want. I want, if something's got to be high energy, like it's got to also like throw me for like insane curveballs, you know. It's got to have like, oh, Mad Max actually he's now can do magic. Like halfway through the film, that would be the, if I really like this film, but if it was one of my favorite films, it would have some kind of like mid-film twist where he's like, I actually now have a sword now, and I'm gonna, you know, which obviously is not what this film is going for. If anything, that's the exact opposite of what this film is going for. It is continually about being like resourceful and efficient and like tightly controlled with all of the elements it introduces. You know, even its themes, like it does such a great job of never being wasteful. It's always like, okay, we're going to set up this one theme, and it's going to be about how Mad Max is like his bodily autonomy gets taken away from him right at the start. He's used as a literal blood bag, a literal object, and at the end he turns around and goes from that moment to then using his own blood to save Furiosa out of like a sense of like compassion and the fact that they've built a good bond together. Like that's a great turnaround, efficient storytelling thing to introduce, which is cool. You know, it is good. Like I like it, but at the same time, I also like when things just like are hard good. You know, I want things to be shit because that's what I like. I want it to just be like more ridiculous. Which obviously would just make it worse for everyone else, right? Like I can't just push that on the film and be like, this should be an anime. Then I would like it, you know, because it's not that, right? That is a ridiculous criticism. It's not really a criticism even. It's just like an expression of this, like the only things I give 9s or 10s are like these very specific weird things, you know.
I think what Tom Hardy said about the film was that it's like this relentless barrage of complexities, but like presented in a completely linear storyline, to the point that it just is incredibly digestible, which I think is, like you say, part of the reason that you prefer something a bit more outlandish that will present like a new idea halfway through and catch you off your feet. And like you say, with it being anime, I mean that always helps. Like it can do different, like a more appealing visual style rather than just like the kind of the color scheme this film has. You mentioning Redline's interesting, because I think what I want from narrative, like narratives in general, is different to you in terms of the thing very compelling about Redline to me was that I think I even said this in the podcast, but didn't do a very good job. And I'm sure if you go back and listen to Redline, we talk about Fury Road in that podcast.
It all comes together.
But what I liked in Redline was that it was a race, and you can understand a race. It already has clear like stakes you can get invested in, and I liked that the plot of the film was like the race, and then there were a lot of like there was character and flavor around that. But fundamentally, the easy narrative win is have all these like cutaways and like these interesting world buildings. But at the end of the day, like Fury Road, you know, it's a chase. Redline was a race. And for me, my issue with like Funky Boy and stuff was that it was taking away from that like really simple like baseline, and it just like it got lost in all of the like excess to the point that Redline ends with the race, but it doesn't matter because like the world's ended. whereas I was invested in Redline up until the point that all that stuff started happening.
Yeah.
And I think what I kind of wanted to touch upon before we kind of I wrapped up this episode was just the kind of film I like, which is something like Fury Road, a film that works on a base level and it's just, you know, it feels tight, it feels well constructed, well written. It's often going to have like a genre tint, whether it's like action or sci-fi or, you know, like a crime film. But then you have this like deeper level of kind of like almost, you can almost watch the film in two ways. And I think for me the best kind of art that engages me the most are things that are genre films that are incredibly accessible, and I can watch as a dumb guy, and then I can watch like a 10-minute YouTube video and be like, oh, actually, I'm a smart guy now. You know, I think pretty much well, there are obviously exceptions, like there are art house films that don't fit this rule, but if you look at most of my favorite films, they do fit into like the same category of like, oh yeah, this is like a science fiction or like horror or action film that has like a deeper kind of political or philosophical subtext to it and works on multiple levels. And I think Fury Road is the epitome of this, where it's just a very, very tactile, tight, well written, well constructed action film that just from that like solid base of enjoyment, which for already would be a 10 out of 10 for me, you just have all this extra, like all these extra branches kind of coming out.
I like how Funky Boy is just part of our lexicon now.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally like a Chekhov's gun style narrative element, except it's kind of like the exact opposite. Chekhov's gun is like about...
If you don't show a gun in the first act, then you'd better bring in a nuke in the third.
Yeah. Chekhov's got a gun, or... I know this is just me explaining an in-joke, which is never funny, or Chekhov's gun, or Morbius's bats, as I like to call them, as it's the same thing in the hit film Morbius, where he has bats, and then they like, oh, they come back later. I'm like, that's what we should call it from now on. Morbius's bats is the exact opposite to like the Funky Boys of just like taking a harsh left turn, which is like very rarely done because it's just not like the expected thing in films. It's just like it's something completely out there of being like, okay, now we're gonna go off road. You know, if this is a race, we're taking a hard left off the course into the stands. You know, you're sitting there watching the film, the car hits you. That's what I want.
I just thought that it was interesting how what Terry talks about really, really liking in a film is when something presents it just presents this new theme or this new idea out of nowhere, and I'm definitely more on Harry's side of things, where I really like it if something has a conceit and sticks to that, and builds upon it and tries to, I guess, subvert expectations and things. But you can't subvert expectations for me by just like pulling a Funky Boy, just having something that is so outfield, and it's a little bit like what you need for a great twist in a movie, which is that it's got to be something very unforeseeable but completely foreseeable at the same time. And it's a really delicate balance that's hard to get right, for something to come out of nowhere but also be something that feels like it still sticks with the original conceit of the film. And films often try and do that but kind of struggle a little bit. And something I guess I now appreciate about Mad Max is the fact that what it does quite well is it has that enjoyment you can get just from watching the film and appreciating the really, really great just filming work that's being done on all levels, while still look a little bit, well, you don't really have to look much deeper, but you can look deeper. And one thing that I think really helped this along actually was what Jonathan said about why he thinks the ending is just it's the ending that you needed to have. And he mentions that there aren't any alternatives. What you realise as you go to the end of the world almost is that you can't just carry on running from your problems. You've got to go back and face it and look at what you already had and see what you can do to resolve it, rather than just going on and on forever, because it's not the solution. And I think it was Jonathan iterating that really did it for me, that made me think, actually, no, you know what? He's kind of made me rethink about the ending of the film from a different point of view, as well as the stuff that Harry had said off podcast. And And it's good. I like the fact that we can talk about these films in a lot of depth, and you can kind of change your opinions just from having a conversation with someone. I think it really goes to show the power of just having a conversation with people about a film.
I don't want to come off as too negative, as much as I'm doing it too because I'm playing the heel, because we can't just all just say like it's good X 100 times. I think it's mostly just because, although I'm putting the horse before the cart here, or the blood bag before the Dune vehicle, if you will. I have to say I'm saying a lot of nice things about this film that are like really well done, but I also have to justify giving it only like an 8 out of 10 rather than like a higher score. And I have to just kind of, I don't really know why, as much as I can justify it being like, why. I'm just like kind of trying to think of something. I was like comparing it to the things I've given 9s and 10s. I've been like, I don't know, it could have like some laser beams in it, maybe anything. I'm really trying to think for like something concrete to like base it down, because at the end of the day, like podcasting and review is like trying to find like these analytical, like logical reasons that are like built upon each other and understandable, of like decoding why an element in a film is like logically good. Right, it's like it's good because it does this thing, and that's good because of this thing, but it does ultimately come down to a reason of like, and it's this thing which is cool. It comes down to like a base like human reaction of like, either you find a flaming electric guitar, like, yeah, that is a cool thing I want to see in a film, or you have the reaction of like, that's over the top, I don't like it.
Oh, now we risk heading into just a discussion about scoring, the nature of reviewing, and like how we as people approach media. Like,
well, that's why this podcast is now going to become 8 hours long. I'm taking it off road. I'm doing it. No.
Yeah, you're supposed to be going to the bullet farm, and you've left the road. This isn't me saying, "Oh, Tony, you're wrong. You're gonna like the film more in a second viewing or whatever." Because I feel like you pretty much, you're quite an attentive viewer. I feel like you're the type of person that gets everything on the first viewing, which helps because you don't watch anything.
No, I watch Marvel films. That's why. That's like I'm literally the living incarnation of the tweet. That's like, person who has only seen Boss Baby watching their second film. I'm getting a lot of Boss Baby vibes from this. That's me. That's me, where I'm watching one film and comparing it to the last film I saw.
A lot of my favourite films are films that on my first viewing I kind of think they're like an 8, and I'm like, yeah, that was good, but there are some like things that just don't click with me, and it takes that kind of third viewing for it to like, and it just keeps going up in my estimation, and every time I watch it I like it more. And Fury Road was one of those, and the next film we're going to do on the podcast is also one of those where I liked it but had some real issues, and it took a couple of viewings for me to be like, oh no, the things I didn't like so much are here for a reason, and they kind of gelled with me. So I mean, I'd be interested to know if you'd watch it again and if you'd like it more. But I just find, for me, I often find that a lot of the films that end up being some of my favourites, it does take a couple of viewings, and I don't know what that is about it. Maybe if something's like too close or like too like close to my tastes, sometimes I might bounce off it straight away. But yeah, just thought I'd say
I
that.
definitely believe that, because it's a film that I've like, the story of me watching Fury Road is I watched 40 minutes of it once, and then 2 years later, like rewatched the whole thing. The first watching, I was like, yeah, I'm liking this, but I'm also not seeing anything like that's really like making me think it's super special. And on finishing it, I was like, I liked it, but I wasn't like super, and thought it was very good, but it wasn't like super in love with it.
Before we wrap up, I kind of want to talk about something I love about the film, but also maybe the worst aspect of it, for me anyway. And it's I think I've mentioned this earlier in this podcast, and we've also talked about Uncut Gems. But in films like Goodfellas and Uncut Gems, a lot of the appeal and the comedy for me comes from like people who don't look like actors, who aren't really actors, delivering like very like strange, like esoteric, like hard to understand like lines of dialogue that you like lose in the sound mix. And for some reason that always just like makes me like laugh and smile. And Fury Road has a lot of elements of this, of just like characters with very strange designs. and people who don't look like people who are normally in films, delivering like, like off the wall weird remarks, like the guy that just drinks the milk and says moo, the guy that's basically a libertarian with a nipple ring and like the deficit, the incredible sequence where the guy says like, don't worry, I only have one bullet for Furiosa. And then the next scene is him just firing 2 oversized pistols into the darkness while saying probing, which always makes me laugh. I love that stuff, and I could just do lines from this film that make me laugh all day. But the negative and the downside of it is that I think for the good politics this film has, it kind of just uses people who don't look like us as like shorthand for like they're wrong and evil. And there's kind of like there's a lot of like ableism and like, yeah, like all of the villains are like not the kind of archetypal attractive kind of Hollywood heroes, like they're shorter, they have different things about their bodies, and it kind of like, it almost has this like weird purity to it. And like Joe's ideology, like, he wants like a perfect like son, but also it kind of shares a little bit of that ideology.
Yeah.
And it's like these like kind of like ugly characters who aren't pure, who get like ousted by these like, like attractive more like archetypal characters. And I think that's the worst part of the film. That kind of like it has to, as a shorthand, use this kind of like ableism in the way it presents its villains.
The one point I would say in its favour is it does do a good job of having Furiosa, the lead, be like, oh sorry, I don't know what the correct term is, but like have a disability where their arm is not there.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make it like a weird plot thing. It's just kind of accepted as like, yeah, this is a dangerous world, and people just lose limbs sometimes. This is just a person who doesn't have a limb, and they have to. It doesn't like ignore it. Like it's an element of the story that comes into matter because she has a prosthetic that's like used in like interesting ways for the storytelling, but also it doesn't like blow it out of proportion. It's not like used as like a whole defining character trait. It's not like stylized in the weird way where like a lot of disabilities are, where sometimes in films where it's like it's the classic example is like Professor X in First Class, or in like the X-Men, mutants, and what are they called, mutants, anyway, the mutant storylines, where he's like, okay, he's in a wheelchair, so he has to get into a wheelchair in like a cool way, he can't just be a disabled person. But it doesn't do that. It doesn't give her arm like a weird backstory where it's like, I chop this off fighting a infected radiation demon. It's just like, it's just a detail about her character, which is another part of like the very natural and good world building and like implied setting. I'll recap my score from earlier, my points from earlier. Just, I think this film is very solidly constructed, and it has a very, despite it's a mean word, like, in addition to being tightly constructed, it also uses that like very solid craftsmanship to present a unique and interesting world, some great energetic performances and characters, and very well shot energetic action set pieces. I think we haven't given this film enough credit for the fact that it's like a car chase film that manages to break up its action set pieces into interesting ways. Like, it doesn't get too tired, I'll say. It maybe a little bit too long, maybe, I don't know. But like, for the most part, it does a good job of like having varied action set pieces, despite most of the film just being cars, shooting each other or whatever. Yeah, maybe like part of why I'm not like super in love with it is the fact that it is like very reliant on the central conceit of it being a singular chase. Famously, I was not a huge fan of the film Ambulance, which maybe draws inspiration from Fury Road, just being this like entirely like singular, like very locked into this track of this one extended set piece, effectively, of like a race. But despite that, it's there's still a lot to like about it. Yeah, and I am very happy to give it an 8 out of 10.
I think similar to what Harry said a bit earlier, when like on a first watch, kind of thinking, oh yeah, this is like an 8 out of 10 good film, and it's just kind of stuck with me. Watched some of the more in-depth reviews, watched it again, and now I'm in a place where I'm just like, well, yeah, that's a 10, easy 10, and I mean, for all the things I've said before, I'm never good at these recaps. I've said why it's a 10. Ethan, do you want to go next?
I'll step in. I'm glad we did this because it was between doing Last of Us, which I think is a fantastic game, and I don't think my score would have changed talking about it. We wouldn't have really covered any new ground, as Harry already said. And same with What Remains of Edith Finch. I know what I think about that game, and I don't think my opinion could have been swayed. You couldn't have made me actively hate it or dislike it. But I'm glad that we did this one because I think it inspired more of an in-depth conversation as to pros and cons, which I don't think we would have been able to do as such in the other ones, because we have people on the podcast who have varying levels of how much they like or dislike this film and different aspects of it. So I'm really glad we did it. And the big plus for me is that I like the film. The time just now where I'd rewatched it for the second time, so my third viewing, was the time I'd enjoyed the film the most. And talking about this film has furthered my enjoyment because it made me realise the things that I appreciate about it that I don't actively think of when I think of Mad Max Fury Road. What I normally think of is, it's a 2-hour film, I tend to get a headache quite early on, the filming technique doesn't entirely stick with me, used to have issues with the endings, not as much now. And I don't think it's a perfect film, and it still doesn't appeal to me in the same way that it does, I think, to you, Jonathan, or Harry. But I see enough good in it that I would give it a 7 out of 10 and say that it's a pretty good film.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear. Yeah, I mean, we've said a lot about it. We talked about how good the filmmaking is, the messages behind the film, some of the kind of key elements that make it great. But, like, fundamentally, at the end of the day, when I put Mad Max Fury Road on, I do it because I want to have a good time, I want to watch the exhilarating action scenes, listen to the fantastic music, and just kind of, like, get lost in it. For me, it is personally one of my favourite films, and I'm kind of, like, it's kind of growing in my estimation the more I kind of watch it and think about it. Like, it's had a pretty meteoric rise in my, if I was to have a top 250, it would have a pretty meteoric rise in the past kind of year and a half. But yeah, it's just a really good film. It's, for me, maybe the best action film ever made. Well, pretty comfortably for me. But I think I would make that point as, like, if I was, like, arguing with someone about the best action film, I think it deserves to be in the conversation. I think it's it really is a film of our times, and I struggle to see how it can be topped, honestly. I have no idea if George Miller ever gets the rights to Mad Max back, how he can make another one. But all I know is that I'd be there opening night, because I'm very invested now, and yeah, it's definitely a 10 for me. So yeah, I think that wraps up the podcast. Thank you for listening and for being on it, guys.
Yeah,
You're welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you for being on the Mediate podcast.
Yeah.
I'm a founding member.
So, I mean, that's just not true.
No.
Next week, not next week, next podcast. Maybe it'll be next week. Who knows? Johnny is hosting, and I think he's picking Disco Elysium. Is that right, Johnny?
I just really want to kick myself into gear and actually, I say finish the game, start the game. Yeah, no. Do I say what it's gonna be?
Go on then.
Or just
give the listeners a chance to watch it in time for the podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my pick for next time, my final pick is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. So look forward to that, and then forget about it, and then remember in a very harsh way, right near the end.
Podcast.